The human thigh bone was cracked perfectly in half, but they didn't eat the marrow inside. They carefully scraped it out and packed it into a stone bowl. Which leaves one unresolved question. If you're starving in a frozen cave, what exactly are you feeding that is more important than yourself? I'd rather just freeze. We'll get back to that open loop at number 1. Alright, let's start. Number 10. The living tap. Your hands are completely numb. The wind is howling, you have no food, no firewood, and the snow is waist deep. If you stop moving, you die. Nomadic tribes on the Eurasian steppes survived brutal whiteout blizzards by drinking from their horses without actually killing them. They'd take a small blade, nick the animal's jugular vein, bleed a pint of hot blood directly into a pouch, and then patch the horse's neck with mud and horsehair. The blood provided immediate liquid heat and calories. Historians used to think this was just an exaggeration by Roman writers trying to make the nomads look like monsters. But modern veterinary studies confirm a healthy horse can lose up to 2 gallons of blood without dropping its core temperature or slowing down in the snow. It kept the riders alive for a few more hours, but hot blood doesn't help much when your body demands solid food, or at least something that used to be solid. Number 9. The stomach sludge. In the Arctic Circle, fuel to melt drinking ice was incredibly scarce. So if you managed to kill a reindeer, you didn't let its internal fluids go to waste. Hunters would slice open the animal's stomach and drink the chyme, a hot, thick soup of half-digested moss, stomach acid, and water. Nutritionists argue it was essential for preventing scurvy in a zero-vegetable diet, which sounds scientific until you realize they were just surviving on hot, acidic grass vomit. But hey, at least they weren't sleeping in it. Number 8. The manure bed. When the ground froze solid for months at a time in Iron Age Northern Europe, surviving the night meant getting creative with animal waste. The bacterial decomposition of manure generates extreme heat, sometimes reaching up to 150 degrees Fahrenheit in the center of a dense compost pile. Families would build their winter shelters directly over livestock pens, piling the fresh waste against the walls and literally burying themselves in the older, composting layers to trap the warmth. Archaeologists originally assumed these shared human-animal structures were just built for spatial efficiency, but thermal modeling of reconstructed Iron Age longhouses proved that without the ambient heat of 100 pounds of fermenting cow waste, the indoor temperatures would have dropped to fatal levels within hours. It wasn't just warm, though. The ammonia gas produced by the waste was so thick it caused chronic respiratory failure. You survived the cold, but you spent 6 months breathing in toxic fumes until your lungs permanently scarred. It was a miserable way to spend the winter, but at least you had room to stretch out, which is a luxury you lose entirely if you get caught in a blizzard. Number 7. The mammoth womb. Hunting across the open tundra during the last ice age meant you were entirely exposed. If a sudden whiteout hit, you couldn't dig through the permafrost to make a shelter. Instead, you used what you just killed. Hunters would hollow out the abdominal cavity of a freshly dead woolly mammoth, crawl inside the steaming chest, and pull the thick hide shut. A recently killed 6-ton mammal acts as a massive, wet, insulated sleeping bag that retains body heat for hours before the frost completely sets in. Anthropologists point out that the residual heat transfer from that much thermal mass could easily prevent human hypothermia through the worst of a sub-zero night. The problem was the timing. Once a mammoth carcass completely freezes, the tissues undergo extreme rigor mortis and lock into solid ice. If you didn't force your way out before the surrounding temperature dropped too far, you were permanently entombed inside a frozen ribcage. You survived the storm, but you died in the morning, which is still a better fate than what they did to the food. Number 6. The bog butter. Ancient Europeans didn't have refrigerators, so they used the next best thing: acidic swamps. People would pack massive chunks of meat and animal fat into bladders and bury them deep in peat bogs before winter hit. The cold, oxygen-free acid prevented rotting, instead turning the fat into a waxy, cheese-like substance. Chemical analysis shows this stuff was perfectly edible centuries later. They basically created a landscape of underground meat lockers. Which sounds smart, until you think about what else happens to bodies when they slow completely down. If you're hoping this list gets a little less disgusting, you should probably just close the tab now. We haven't even answered that open loop yet. Number 5. The winter sleep. In rural Russia, up until the early 1900s, there was a phenomenon called lotska. When the harvest ran out and the snow piled up to the roof, entire villages would simply go to sleep for 6 months. Peasants would gather around the central clay stove, lie down, and enter a state of human torpor. They woke up once a day to eat a single piece of hard bread and drink a cup of water, then went right back to sleep. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They just shut down. Medical historians argue it wasn't true biological hibernation, just extreme calorie conservation forced by mass starvation. But doctors who visited these regions recorded resting heart rates and body temperatures so abnormally low that modern physiology struggles to explain how these people didn't slip into fatal comas. They existed in a gray area between alive and dead, which is exactly the state you want to be in when your food runs out completely, unless your neighbor looks particularly well fed. Number 4, the bone polishers. During Neanderthal winters in northern Europe roughly 40,000 years ago, the megafauna migrated away, and when you starve in the ice, you eat each other. But it wasn't a frenzy. Coprolites, fossilized feces, found in cave systems, show a methodical, terrifying patience. They didn't just strip the meat off the bodies. The fossilized waste contains microscopic fragments of human finger bones. They were eating the hands, chewing the small bones completely into paste to extract every microgram of fat. Anthropologists suggest this might have been ritualistic mourning, but the striations on the remaining bones show they were cracked with heavy stones purely for caloric extraction. There was no ceremony. You were just dinner. And even dinner doesn't matter if your shelter blows away in the wind. Number 3, the blood bricks. In deep antiquity in Siberia, surviving a blizzard meant building windbreaks. If you didn't have wood or stone, you used snow. But dry snow crumbles. So they bled their sled dogs, just a little bit, and mixed the hot blood with the snow and ice dust. The blood acted as an organic binding agent. When it froze, it turned the slush into concrete-hard crimson bricks. The tensile strength of frozen blood ice is documented to be 3 times stronger than standard compacted snow. You were essentially building a house out of your pet's life force. But building a wall is one thing. Fixing your own body is another. Number 2, the frostbite snap. Frostbite isn't just cold skin. It's the water inside your cells turning into ice daggers that shred your tissue from the inside out. Once it turns black, the tissue is dead, and gangrene is next. Ancient tribes in the Arctic didn't have antibiotics or sterile saws to amputate, so they let the cold finish the job. If a finger or toe went necrotic, they would intentionally expose just that digit to the extreme freezing air until it was solid as rock. Then, they would just snap it off. Medical texts confirm that auto-amputation by deep freezing actually cauterizes the blood vessels and destroys the nerve endings, preventing immediate fatal infection. It was a brutal, self-administered surgery with a 0% survival rate if you hesitated. But sometimes, staying alive meant sacrificing the very thing that made you human. Number 1, the Marrow flame. We're back in the caves of northern Europe. A brutal glacial winter. When archaeologists excavated Goyet Cave in Belgium, they found Neanderthal remains that had been thoroughly butchered. As we established earlier, cannibalism in the deep winter wasn't uncommon, but one detail didn't make sense, which brings us back to our open loop. The human thigh bone was cracked perfectly in half, but the marrow inside wasn't eaten. It had been carefully scraped out and packed into small, fire-blackened stone bowls. If you are starving to death, bone marrow is the most calorie-dense substance available. You don't throw it away. The official explanation was that this was a caching behavior, storing fat for later. But experimental archaeology ran the numbers on the lipid degradation, and it doesn't hold up. The fat would have spoiled in the damp cave air before they could eat it. The reality is far worse. They were using human bone marrow as lamp fuel. In the pitch black of a frozen cave, if the central fire dies, the ambient temperature drops to lethal levels within an hour. They ran out of animal fat. They ran out of wood. So they made a choice. They processed their own dead, not to feed their stomachs, but to feed the fire. They sat in the dark, shivering, watching the burning liquid remains of their family member flicker, knowing exactly what or who, was keeping them warm, and knowing exactly who was going into the fire next. The thing about human survival is that we like to romanticize it. We call it resilience. But usually it's just a terrified primate doing something utterly repulsive because the alternative is turning into a popsicle. The subscribe button is down there. I'll be back with more of this, unfortunately.